All right, part two. So we have habitat loss and we have invasive or non-native species. We should put in there, we did pollution. I like to do another P, human population, because of course we're threatening biodiversity just by the things we do. Then we'll have in a moment overconsumption or over exploitation, and then of course climate change. So we talked about in chapter 24 the carbon dioxide or the carbon cycle and this dramatic increase in carbon dioxide, which carbon dioxide is one of our many greenhouse gases. And while itself, the molecule is not the most potent greenhouse gas, that's something like methane, but there's such an abundance of it that that's what's causing the issue. So locking in increased warmth in the Earth's atmosphere essentially has led to changes in climate. So the planet's erratic temperature patterns, more severe storms, melting glaciers, all are resulting from an increase in global temperature. So there's some examples there if you would like to document that. Okay, so the O, overconsumption or overexploitation. So essentially, remember how we were looking at maybe exponential growth and logistic growth, and there's a carrying capacity. So the trouble is like if we're diminishing a population so that it is not able to reperpetuate itself, then we're threatening that particular population. So we've done this in the example of food. We have overharvested yellowfin tuna. We have overharvested Atlantic cod. And it goes on and on and on and on. So when we overharvest or overexploit, then what would be a renewable resource is no longer renewable. For example, Atlantic cod and yellowfin tuna. So that is certainly a concern. Overexploitation also exists in the form of collecting rare plants and the dealing of various animal parts, usually illegally. We know certainly that has resulted in overexploitation. Of course, elephant tusks is the first thing that comes to mind to me, being a huge problem in the past, which is getting somewhat better now. Okay, last topic. Let's see, we have direct values and indirect values of biodiversity. So direct values, we directly benefit from the medicinal value of plants. So we have discovered, for example, the major medication that was used for a long time for breast cancer, Taxol, comes from the yew tree, the Pacific yew tree. So we know that we've been inspired and have found medicinal substances in everything from bacteria to fungi to horseshoe crabs to a variety of plants. And so it's super important to be thinking about the loss of biodiversity may also cause us to lose a medicinal value for that particular, for ourselves. So being a little bit selfish. So direct value is medicinal value. Of course, we have medicinal leeches. So leeches release an anticoagulant into the blood to prevent it from clotting. So it's super helpful in areas where you need to increase blood flow along a wound from recent surgery. All right, agricultural value of biodiversity. You've probably heard about the importance of bees. The big things affecting bees, of course, spraying our lawns and spraying farms with a variety of herbicides is killing the plants that bees like to eat. So that one's a no-brainer, and it gets trickier from there. But it's super important for us to use chemicals sparingly. So if you need Roundup, only use it isolated areas and not just make a habit of using it all over your yard. It's better to have a yard with biodiversity and lots of different flowering plants, like clover is one that comes to mind. Even if you do mow it, you can mow it in a slightly higher setting so that you allow for some food for bees. Here we see bats as pollinators, and we see ladybugs. Ladybugs are very good at eating some of our plant pests. So yes, we need pollinators like bees and bats and all the things so that we actually have the fruits that we like to eat. And I'm going to tell you, you'll be hard pressed to think of something a lot of things that we eat are actually fruits. Peanuts are fruits, zucchini are fruits, cucumbers are fruits, green beans are fruits. Botanically speaking, they're fruits. So if it's a fruit, it came from a fertilized flower, and how's it going to get fertilized? There's different ways for plants to be pollinated. One of those is by animals, one's by wind, one's by water. And many of our food crops are actually pollinated by animals. An exception would be corn and oats and some of those grassy crops. All right, let's go to some indirect values of biodiversity. So essentially, these are benefits we're getting from biodiversity, but it's really hard to quantify it because it's not really part of our economy. So they're indirect because it's not easy to calculate a dollar amount associated with them. But what we know is that that particular service that the ecosystem is performing is, when it's been compromised, it's monetarily detrimental to us. Okay, so let's take some examples. Waste disposal. So think about the idea that we have organisms that are actually really good at breaking down stuff. So we talked about detritivores and decomposers, but there are some organisms that can actually break down pollutants such as heavy metals and pesticides. So essentially, when we think about the role of those organisms, it's indirect because we don't really put a value on that. Just like we don't really put a value on all the dead leaves and twigs and branches and all the dead stuff, particularly in our area of the United States where we have very pronounced seasons. When we lose those leaves in the fall and they land on the ground, you have to ask yourself, where's it going to go? Well, it essentially is degraded away by decomposers. Even if you never, ever, ever rake, it disappears. So that's an indirect value of nature would be decomposition and recycling of nutrients. What about fresh water? I have well water. So right here at the house, we have well water. We don't really have to do anything to treat it. So we have to ask ourselves, well, what is the value of fresh water? And what is the value of water that's no longer fresh? How are we going to replace that service that's provided by nature by doing it ourselves? So it's super interesting that natural ecosystems exert a sponge effect, and they soak up the water and release it at a steady state, so it's regulating how much water is available. Now we know when we have flooding events, many flooding events come from very large storms. Very large storms are increasing in number as a result of global warming. So when we have those big storms and we have a lot of flooding, it actually compromises this provision of fresh water because now we may have a boil order. So indirect value of biodiversity is having fresh water. We also have the prevention of soil erosion. So when we have grass in our yard and along the medians of our interstates, if we have a variety of wildflowers being planted and we have trees growing on the sides of our roads, essentially those plants are using their roots and locking in the soil so we're not eroding the soil. Once we erode soil, we are going to be hard pressed to find a way to replace that soil. So I know there is topsoil that you can buy for your garden and so on, but imagine that you might have, 100 square miles of land that's been devastated. You're not going to be able to replace that soil, the topsoil in that area. So it would just be lost. So this provision or prevention of soil erosion is an important indirect value. So biogeochemicals. Thinking about the cycling of our chemicals, we know that this happens. It just happens. No one has to pay for it to happen or, set up some machines or some equipment and timers and all that kind of thing. What we know is it happens. And so these natural cycles, this biogeochemical cycling is so important to the flow of energy on the planet and our chemical cycles. And we can't really substitute that through technology. So if we're going to compromise various parts of those cycles, then we need to stop and say, okay, well, how would we replace that? Well, the thing is we're not even putting a value on the destruction of any of these indirect values. There's no value. There's estimates out there, but it's not part of our normal economics. Big one, regulation of climate. Same thing. Indirect value, biodiversity. Don't know how to quantify it, but we certainly know what happens when we have compromised it. Okay, the last couple of slides are dealing with sustainability. So a sustainable society essentially can provide the same level of goods and services for future generations while maintaining biodiversity now. I've also heard sustainability referred to as meeting the needs of the present without compromising the needs of the future. So essentially, we want to ensure that we're not taking more than we need, but certainly not taking so much that we're leaving future generations in a deficit. Okay? So here's some characteristics of an unsustainable society. You can probably guess some of these. Deforestation, erosion of topsoil and groundwater depletion, urban sprawl, loss of wildlife habitat. We have, of course, air and water pollution, global warming. We've got chemicals here, pesticides, fertilizers, and hazardous waste. Overfishing, which we call overexploitation, loss of terrestrial habitats. All characteristics of an unsustainable society. So then we ask ourselves, well, what is a characteristic of a sustainable society? Well, instead of just spraying herbicides and pesticides, let's do something called integrated pest management. So let's take a look at selected use of herbicides and pesticides, but also let's increase the biodiversity. So we might plant many different kinds of plants in on a farm so that there's some natural preventatives like bringing in good insects to fight off the bad insects. But if all we have is one monocrop, one whole field of the same kind of crop, then it becomes literally a target for disease and for predators. So we have here energy efficient temperature control, so thinking about green roofs, even growing food on the walls of buildings, using mass transit more efficiently, and of course energy efficient transportation. So let's think about hydrogen fuel cell and electric technology with our mass transportation. Recycling, composting. Here on the left we have wetland and delta preservation and restoration. So thinking about the Chesapeake Bay and the Gulf of Mexico, we want to ensure that whatever we're putting on our land upstream isn't devastating essentially our bays. Here we see a multi-use farming. So we're going to have to think of a way to better farm our food. Again, thinking about integrated pest management and growing multiple crops is a really good idea. And ensuring that our land is maintained and can be productive for future generations. So that's it. That was the end of chapter 25. If you made it through all of my videos, thank you. Okay, take care.